Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining the 10th Annual Tribal Healing to Wellness Court Virtual Enhancement Training. You have joined session D4, Creating a Place of Welcome, Mitigating Trauma in the Courthouse by Understanding Changes to the Brain, presented by the Honorable Kim McGinnis. My name is Catherine Ratana, and I am a tribal law specialist with the Tribal Law and Policy Institute. I'm also joined by my colleague, Abby.
Thank you, Catherine. Recordings will be available on this platform and enhancementtraining.org. Again, thank you all for joining us, and I will now turn it over to today's presenter to begin.
Thank you. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Kim McGinnis. I'm the judge for the Pueblo, Pojoaque, which is a small tribe in northern New Mexico, just north of Santa Fe. And before I became an attorney and a judge, I was a neuroscientist. So I studied the brain, got a PhD in neuropharmacology from the University of Michigan, and then did a postdoc at Harvard Medical School. And we primarily, in the lab that I got my graduate degree in, we studied the effects of methamphetamine on the brain, or amphetamines, and how that basically brought about addiction, and searching for ways to prevent the that addictive quality, to study the mechanism of how that worked. So I talk a lot about to my staff and to other judges and other communities about what happens in the brain as a result of substance use disorders, and I'll talk about that today with some diagrams and some, kind of nerdy brain stuff that I'll be talking about. I tend to bring a brain with me when this is a plastic brain, not a real brain. So, but if I were there with you, I would hand this around so you all could see and feel and look and pull apart the brain and see what it actually looks like inside, as far as the model goes. But we'll do the best we can virtually. This has been such an awesome conference so far. I just want to point out a couple great talks that I saw. One was with Carrie Garrow. Judge Garrow did an amazing presentation about motivational interviewing, and I love that these sessions are being recorded. So I was actually able to go back and watch it because I was interrupted when I was trying to actually watch it live, but I went back and watched it recorded. It was great, and I'll actually touch on some of the themes that Judge Garrow touched on. And then I just finished watching the Family Treatment Court best practices, and again, awesome, really touching some of the themes that I will be talking about today. Because along with substance use disorders, I'm going to talk about trauma and how trauma affects the brain and may lead to, some kind of frustrating behaviors, unexpected behaviors, and that's because of changes in the brain. And most of our participants in our Healing to Wellness courts do have a trauma history along with their substance use disorder history. They really go hand in hand. So I've been the judge here in Pojoaque for about 8 years. We've had a Healing to Wellness court since 2015, so we're starting our 6th year of Healing to Wellness court. Of course, we've done lots of modifications due to COVID, and we've ended up dividing our courts into 2 different sessions so that we could have some people in person and some people on Zoom, and allowing people who don't have any web access or internet, and some folks don't even have ability to have cell phones, so that they are still able to come into the courthouse. So many of you have met Kiki or heard Kiki or seen, heard me talk about Kiki before. So this dog is Kiki. She's our courthouse facility dog, and her job is to mitigate trauma in the courtroom and the courthouse. And she hangs out with our Healing to Wellness court participants when they come into the courthouse. So of course, COVID, it's impacting our work. It's impacting how we work with our clients, and it's impacting how we're able to work with the key components of Healing to Wellness courts. Staffings are difficult. We've had here, unfortunately, we did have a positive COVID among my staff, so we had to evacuate. Many of us had to quarantine. There was no spread. Nobody else turned up positive, but all of the courts were all dealing with these issues. If a participant comes up positive, what do we do? Many courts are not allowing in-person drug testing, in-person court sessions, in-person meetings. We've kind of had a balance of allowing people to appear by video conferencing, by phone, but we are still continuing in-person drug and alcohol testing, because at first we didn't, and people were so cut off. We did have a lot of crises at the beginning of this pandemic when we were trying to figure out how we can safely interact with folks. So we've modified, but we're now back to doing in-person drug testing and alcohol testing. And we also are I'm fortunate enough to have a large enough courtroom that we can spread people out. So as I said, we're having 2 wellness court sessions a week now. So we usually have 20 to 25 participants in general. So we're able to get most people in one of those 2 sessions, and having some participants coming in by Zoom and some team members coming in by Zoom. So we're all struggling, and that creates a lot more stress. That creates a lot more trauma responses. You know, peer recovery meetings aren't really happening. We're having some small ones here at the courthouse where they're able to spread out enough. But without our participants being able to have that kind of in-person peer recovery, it's very difficult. You know, of course, we provide resources for them to do the online peer recovery, but it's just not the same as having the face-to-face, the actual face-to-face time, because we know that our connection as judges, our connection with our participants is not as good when it's by video conferencing, and the same with peer-to-peer meetings are not, just doesn't have the same feel, the same connection, the same intimacy. So we're all struggling, we understand that. And, you know, it's, you know, we're wearing masks when we're not out and about. So we're all in our courtrooms wearing masks. That's my Kiki mask that I had made at the beginning of the pandemic with Kiki's lovely face on it. And I gave that to all my team as kind of a bonding thing. But now, you know, we're 6 months later after those masks. I didn't think we'd still be here in this crisis, but we are, and probably will be for another year or so. And one of the main things that's happened, of course, is that besides peer recovery groups, pro-social activities have really stopped. I mean, we were doing awesome we're having monthly community dinners. We were having weekly community breakfasts. Anybody could come, you know, it was focused on people in recovery, but anybody could come, they could bring their families. They knew that every Friday morning they could have breakfast, that once a month we would have a community night and a game night and other community activities, and that's all ground to a halt because of course we can't have people. There's no more communal eating. Our graduations are different. We've had people graduate, but we've had to promise that, you know, once the vaccination's here, we can start getting back together. We will bring all those graduates back to have the true celebration that we normally have with them when they graduate. Of course, we do as much as we can to, you know, say, yay, you're commencing, you're moving on, but it's not the same without having the communal meal that we normally would have when folks graduate. You know, almost every talk, people are going to talk about being a trauma competent organization, trauma responsive, and you know, when I'm talking about that, and what I'll be talking about through my presentation is an organization that, so first of all, understands, can recognize and respond to folks having trauma. And so a lot of that, what I'll talk about is what it looks like when somebody might be having a trauma response and what might be going on in their brain. And then it also, some organization that focuses on creating safety, physical, psychological, and emotional safety. And then it helps people rebuild a sense of control and empowerment by giving people choices, agency, the ability to make some choices. Of course, we're courts, and you know, we like to tell people what to do, but it's really important that people are having a choice and are involved in their case management, involved in their planning, so that we know what they need, we know that what they think will do them the most good, and not that, you know, they can choose, oh, I don't want to be drug tested, but that they have some choice and some agency and some power to make their own treatment plan for what they think will work best for them, just that we take that input into account. And, you know, I'm not saying that Pojoaque is perfect by any means. This is, what I'm talking about is today is aspirational. And of course, we're all making mistakes and learning along the way as we create our communities around our Healing to Wellness Court, because that's what, you know, those of us who have Healing to Wellness Courts or any type of problem solving courts know that what we are creating is a community for our participants. And we really often take the place of people's families while they're in our treatment courts, because we're the stable presence. And, you know, the importance of the judge, Judge Garrow talked about it, and the family treatment court folks talked about it, and I sometimes don't really understand it or recognize it or keep it in mind enough, that, you know, participants and staff and the community look to the judge as the leader and look to the judge to set the tone and to create the space and create the feeling of welcome. And, I named this talk Creating a Place of Welcome because, what we try to do is create a place where people feel safe to come, so even if they're coming and they are going to be positive for a drug screen, we want people to feel safe to come in and know that even if they did have a return to use, that we're not going to, we're not going to sanction them simply for a return to use. We sanction, for other things, for not showing up, or for not, for lying, or for, going out, not following their curfew, things like that. But if somebody comes in and says, to our probation officer, I used last night, we do a treatment response. We don't make that a sanction. That's not something punishable by itself, because as we all know, addiction is a disease, a chronic relapsing disease. With trauma that is so tied to substance use. When I talk about trauma, the definition I'd like to use is it's any experience that overwhelms a person's ability to stay present. So that's, when people are talking to you and they're not actually there because they're off either in their trauma, or maybe they aren't even aware that they're in their trauma, but they're just no longer present. Or sometimes it's causing people to act out in ways that are really surprising, to get angry, to get abusive sometimes to staff members. A lot of times that's folks who are acting out of trauma. And it doesn't excuse the behavior, but it is a reason so that we can understand why folks may be acting out of that trauma. And of course, we're stressed, our participants are stressed. People are stressed when they come to court in general. They're anxious about their case. They're not able to connect with folks, with their peers. Some folks have lost their jobs. They're being furloughed. They have food insecurity, housing insecurity. They may be worried about being evicted because they can't make their rent. Obviously, childcare now is a huge issue for people who have school-age children, because a lot of times they're being schooled at home. And so what are people supposed to do? They can't leave their kids at home alone. Even if they're older, they can't leave their kids home alone because nobody's watching them to make sure they're actually doing their schoolwork. So people aren't able to work because of that. So there's so much going on. There's a lot of return to use. I'm sure most of you are seeing that in your communities, that there's a lot of folks who are struggling with staying sober, maintaining their sobriety, struggling with getting to court because they can't leave their children home. They can't get transportation, all the usual things, but now it's all compounded. So, we all have to, of course, modify how we're working with our participants because of what's going on with COVID. Sometimes people get really frustrated when folks don't show up to court, especially at the beginning if somebody comes into court, they say they have a DUI, and they, decide to enter wellness court, and we find that they're eligible, they do their intake, they're high risk, high needs. So we get them into wellness court, and then they don't show up for 2 weeks. So, an old response might've been, let's just issue a warrant, throw them in jail, and forget it. They obviously don't want to be in wellness court. But, what we need to realize is that, they're dealing with their trauma, they're dealing with coming into court, they're still dealing with not having any stable sobriety. So we can't expect our participants to get better before we're willing to able to help them. So, I always tell my staff, in the first 3 months of somebody being in our court, they're really, they're not going to be able to comply, because they show up and they, show up pretty regularly and pretty on time. Then that's really all I'm asking during the first 3 months, because we're trying to get their brain to heal to a point where they are able to work with us in a more steady way, and they are able to get into treatment and really participate and start being able to take it in. But during the first few months, and I'll show you some slides in a minute, people's brains are just not functioning well enough because of their chronic relapsing substance use disorder. So our goal is to get trauma competent, healing focused courts. And one of the ways to do that, of course, is to use language that is trauma responsive. So throughout my talk, I try to use language that is more trauma responsive, trauma focused. So you'll notice I say return to use. I don't use the term relapse or lapse or even slip. It is a return to use. Of course, I don't use addict or junkie. I think we've all moved beyond that. You know, I use substance use disorder, people struggling with substance use disorders, people struggling with substance misuse, you know, so, and we don't use clean and dirty, and that's really hard. And it's, our clients use that terminology, but we use, you know, positive for this presence of alcohol, positive for the presence of cocaine or whatever, or negative for the presence. Because people say, if you tell people they're clean, or you tell people they're dirty, you know, that has a lot of judgment in that language. So they use medicine for addiction treatment rather than medicine-assisted treatment. So, and it's a struggle, but it's really important for us to pay attention to what sort of language we're using when we're working with our participants. So the changes to the brain, and I talked about changes to the brain already with respect to substance use disorders, substance misuse, and trauma, but there's other changes that are going on in our folks' brains, or that has already happened, including a lot of our participants are going to be struggling with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. Many undiagnosed cases will be of our participants, because that kind of screening is not general. It's not, so just so you know, there are potentially some cognitive deficits due to fetal alcohol spectrum disorder among our population, among our participants. Toxic stress will change the brain, and I'll talk about that. Historical trauma also may change the brain. So, you know, parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, the trauma that they suffered is actually being passed down through the generations. And the science is now catching up to that to show that mechanism. And I'll talk a little bit about that mechanism because it's super complicated, but the science is actually starting to catch up to it. And then many of our participants might have traumatic brain injuries. They could be veterans who were exposed while they're in the military to loud noises that can create a traumatic brain injury, or, you know, being actually in an accident. That can create a concussion with post-concussive symptoms. Also, domestic violence survivors often have undiagnosed traumatic brain injuries. So just to understand, there's a lot going on in the brain in our participants that might relate to the choices they're making around using substances, partly to alleviate symptoms from other substances. And, you know, there's, of course, co-occurring issues in most of our clients. These slides are from studies done by these two people, Stein and McAllister. These were veterans. So this is just showing the relationship between depression, substance use, PTSD, chronic pain, TBI. These are veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan that they studied. And this is just a list of the overlapping symptoms between basically traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress disorder. So trauma and brain injury, there's a lot of overlapping, potentially overlapping symptoms that we might see in folks in our court, like the irritability. People are really cranky sometimes when they come to court, especially at the beginning of wellness court phases. People can be super cranky with us. And so we need to be a little compassionate, understanding about that. You know, the hyperarousal, we see people who are reacting strongly to their environment for some reason, getting triggered. And I'll talk about the mechanism in our brain of why that might be going on, and why people sometimes react to things that we don't expect them to react to in their environment, but they're being triggered because of potentially because of past trauma. I'm not going to go through all these brain things, so don't get scared. So the three parts of the brain that I'd like to focus on are the prefrontal cortex. That's the front part of the brain here. That's the thinking part of the brain. That's the part of the brain that is not well developed in teenagers. So that's the part, you know, where teenagers make the stupid decisions to drive their car 80 miles an hour through, you know, downtown, you know, without thinking about the consequences. But in our people struggling with substance use disorder, the prefrontal cortex is also underdeveloped or not well developed or cut off because of the effects from using the substances. So the brakes, so the prefrontal cortex, the part that allows people to plan, think, just think about what's going to happen 2 weeks from now, 5 weeks from now, is not functioning well at the beginning part of recovery from substance use disorders. The second part of the brain is the amygdala. And the amygdala is like the smoke alarm. So it's always sort of, it's taking in all kinds of environmental stimulus, sight, hearing, touch, smells. And it's always scanning for danger. So it's like a smoke alarm. There might be little tiny things happening, and your amygdala is like picking out things that might be dangerous. And usually it's just anything that's not the status quo. So anything different. Your brain does not like things that are different. Your brain likes things that are the same every day, every day, every day. So, if you're driving home and there's nothing unusual happens, a lot of times you can drive from work to home and you'll have no memory at all of anything that happened along the way, because everything's normal. There wasn't anything different. So your brain isn't going to store any special information because there was nothing special for it to latch onto. But if you're driving home and, suddenly out of the corner of your eye, you see a giraffe or something, you're going to you're going to look at it, you're going to see it, it's not dangerous, potentially if it's in a cage, or, as long as it's, where it's supposed to be. But you're going to remember that. So it's something unusual your brain's going to pick up on. And then the third part of the brain is the hippocampus, and that's where long-term memory is stored. Emotion-laden memory is stored. So those of us who are old enough, that's where, we can remember where we were when we heard about 9/11, So that kind of emotion-laden memory is stored. And because there's something special about it. We don't remember where we were the day before 9/11 unless something really special happened to us that day or out of ordinary. But most of us who are old enough can remember what was going on the morning of September 11th, 2001, when we heard about the attack in New York and the Pentagon. So those are the main parts. The amygdala is also about conditioned responses. And that's, like Pavlov's dog. It's also like, there's experiments with mice where they gave mice these pleasant cherry scent, but then they shocked the mouse. So then the mouse, whenever the mouse smelled that pleasant cherry scent, it had a trauma response, even though it wasn't being shocked. So that's a conditioned response. And we see that also in somebody struggling with substance use disorder, where the conditioned response is they meet the person who they were with, when they use their drug. They remember where they were when they used the drug. So they have a conditioned response to being around those people, places, and things. And that's why treatment providers so stress not to change people, places, and things, because we're trying to, providers want to change the conditioned response so that they don't have the conditioned response at the beginning of their healing. And again, the prefrontal cortex is the brakes. So when the prefrontal cortex isn't working, that means the brakes are basically thrown out, they're faulty. And so the brakes stop impulsive behavior. The prefrontal cortex stops impulsive behaviors. But in folks who are have a trauma history, or folks who are recovering from substance use disorders, these brakes are thrown out. They're faulty. So their impulse control isn't that awesome. Now, this isn't about, doom and gloom that it's never gonna heal. The brain can heal. And that's, one of the key points is that the brain can heal, but it needs to have the space and the supports in order to allow the brain to heal. And that's what healing to wellness courts are great at, is creating spaces and community and, the family of the team to help people create the supports that they need in order for their brains to heal. And one of the things that we're healing is reconnecting the prefrontal cortex so that folks do have the brakes to think about their impulse control around either acting out or going to try to find their drug of choice. And we've all had issues with our prefrontal cortex going offline. Any of us who have lost our tempers, and we've all lost our tempers, that is the prefrontal cortex going offline. So that's an amygdala hijack is what we call that. So the amygdala, you're basically thinking with your amygdala because for whatever reason, your amygdala has decided there's danger, something's going on. So, if I'm on the bench and, this happened when I was a younger judge, you know, that I ever lose my temper and actually, you know, maybe shout at somebody or tell them to be quiet really harshly or, you know, act out in really embarrassing ways in court. And I've learned to be calmer or to stop the proceeding, because your prefrontal cortex and your amygdala are kind of in this balance. And if the amygdala takes over, then the prefrontal cortex goes offline and you lose your mind, and you need to breathe, create space, calm down, and just, you know, give yourself a few breaths, because breathing is really a key to getting your prefrontal cortex back online. So now when I feel myself losing my temper, I can generally, you know, leave the bench or just take a pause, look down and breathe, and allow my prefrontal cortex to come online and allow my anger reaction to get lower. Because, you know, sometimes participants are really good at hooking us and having us lose our temper. And that's, you know, we're humans. Of course, we could be hungry, you know, we could be tired. For whatever reason, our defenses are down and we're not able to maintain, you know, our dignity or maintain the balance between the cortex and the amygdala. And our participants are struggling with that same thing, except they have a trauma history, they have substance use disorder history, so they have changes to their brains that are creating the inability of the prefrontal cortex to maintain that impulse control, to maintain that break. You know, I know you all know this, but, you know, just so we're all on the same page about what a substance use disorder is. So it's, you know, chronic relapsing brain disease. That's the basic definition that I use. It includes a loss of control over the use, high motivation to get the substance. So that's the drug-seeking behavior. You know, we've all seen it where, you know, people can't get to court, they can't get to their services, but, you know, they can get, you know, 15 miles away to meet their connect to get their drug of choice, you know. But then, you know, that's like there's a part of the brain called the locus coeruleus. So if somebody feels like they need to get their drug, that part of the brain, the locus coeruleus, releases adrenaline, and that adrenaline makes people very energized. And so they're very energized to go get their drug. So the brain is giving them the energy to go do whatever it takes to get on the road and hitchhike, because they don't generally use that urgency to get to the court for meetings or get to the court for hearings that they use if they have the outer urgency to go get their drug. And then the main thing that defines a substance use disorder is to continue use despite the negative consequences. So you use even though you know you're going to have an issue with your probation officer. You use even though you know that that's going to maybe delay a return of your child, you know, because you've lost your child. So you're using even though you know that's going to lead to the loss of your child, which is probably, you know, the worst thing that could happen to most people. So that's one of the main indicators that someone has a substance use disorder, is continue to use despite negative consequences. You know, we have people who come in and, you know, they're not really wellness court eligible, they're low risk. And, you know, and I tell people, you know, the way that you show us that you don't have a substance use disorder is by not using the substance, you know. But so people who come in, even if they're low risk, but they still can't stop using, they still have a substance use disorder. Maybe they're not going to be at a risk of using DUIs, of committing another DUI, or they're not high risk enough because it's their first offense, but we still need to provide them with treatment because they do still have a substance use disorder. You know, so stopping using is one of the main indicators. If somebody can actually stop using, and we know that they're stopping using because we're testing them regularly and, you know, randomly and frequently, then, you know, that's one of the ways they show us that they don't have a substance use disorder. So substance misuse, you know, I talked about the person who, you know, gets the adrenaline rush and can run off to Espanola, you know, 15 miles north of here to get heroin. A lot of times substance misuse, so when people first start using the substance, it feels good, it's fun. You know, they get a huge rush, they get this major euphoria, they get this huge bout of pleasure. But it moves from pleasure seeking to relief seeking because of the changes in the brain. So it moves from, yeah, I'm gonna go get high and that's so much fun, to, yeah, I gotta go get well, because people become physically dependent, and then the changes in the brain lead to depression. When they don't have the drug, they don't feel normal, they don't feel good, they hurt, they're in pain, unless they can get their drug of choice to help them. So it's really just relief seeking, and people are miserable, but they're still driven to get that substance. And that's because there's this hijacking of what's called the motivation pathway. So the motivation pathway is these parts of the brain, mostly involving this area called the ventral tegmental area. And then it goes into this nucleus accumbens. So the nucleus accumbens is the reward pathway, the reward center of the brain. And what happens in the nucleus accumbens is there's a release of dopamine. So dopamine is a neurotransmitter, and it binds to the receptor. This is the dopamine receptor, and it causes these effects downstream that cause pleasure. So this is, neuron A releasing huge amounts of dopamine when you're using a drug, an illegal drug, causing pleasurable feelings. So the motivation pathway is necessary for life when it's not being used by illegal substance. Because when you drink water when you're thirsty, when you eat food when you're hungry, when you find your mate, when you're having intimate time with your partner and sex, you get feelings of pleasure. And those are things that we need in order to survive, that animals need to survive. So we get a boost of pleasure from those activities, including the pleasure from the dopamine release. And at the same time, our amygdala is, taking in what was going on when we got that pleasurable water. So, back 10,000 years ago, humans would know where the water source was located because their amygdala would remember, because the amygdala would be taking in that environment of where they got that great water, or where that food source was, or where the herd of bison or whatever they're hunting happened to be at this particular time. So the humans would know, because they would remember, because their amygdala and their hippocampus work together to allow them to remember everything, the time of day, the wind direction, the location, of where the best food source or water sources were. So when people are using drugs, that's the same thing that happens, is that their amygdala takes all that in, the people, places, things of where they were when they got the drug. And then with the drugs, there's a much higher boost of dopamine into the synapse here. So if water gives you a little bit of pleasure and heroin gives you a huge amount of pleasure, then heroin must be really important for survival, because the heroin gives you much more dopamine than the food does. So your brain is going to say, oh, heroin is way more important for survival than water. So that's, we see people choosing to get their drug and buy their drug rather than feed their children and feed themselves, because their brain is telling them that heroin is even more important than water and food. Even if, logically they can say water and food are important, their brain has learned, because of our evolutionary pathways, that heroin, because it gave them a much bigger boost of dopamine, is more important for their survival. And their alarm center of their brain, their locus coeruleus, goes off in alarms when they don't have that drug, because then the brain thinks that they can't survive without the drug because of how it hijacked our natural system. And this motivation pathway, they've had mice where they've knocked out this type of dopamine receptor. And what happens is the mice, they can go get food. They can get up and go get water. They just have no motivation to. So this hijacking, so that without the ability to motivate by using the system, that people will, or the rats do starve because they don't have any motivation to go eat, because they don't get any pleasure from it. So there's no point in it for them. It's just showing how remarkably that motivation pathway is important for survival. And what happens in folks who are using substances is that the brain changes. So this slides are showing, so this side is control. So this is looking down on top of a brain using brain imaging. This part of the brain is where the motivation pathway is. This is the prefrontal cortex area. So this part is the motivation pathway, showing these receptors that are part of that, in that motivation pathway, to have the dopamine bind to create those downstream pleasures. The red is high concentration of the dopamine receptors. So this column of brains are controlled. So these are folks who do not have substance use disorders. And over here are the brain scans from the same level of the brain from folks who do have substance use disorders with cocaine, meth, alcohol, heroin. You also see this with gambling addiction. So it's the same sort of thing. So you can see the red means high concentration of dopamine receptors. And here you don't see any red, a little bit down here with alcohol. But that means that these receptors have downregulated. So the receptors that the dopamine bind to have gone inside. So, say this is the dopamine receptor and the dopamine's coming in. When people are using cocaine or meth or the other drugs, the dopamine is coming in so fast that your brain says, whoa, that's too much dopamine. So it down-regulates, meaning what happens is these receptors go internal. And so there's no place for the dopamine to bind to. And that's why we have, when people are struggling with substance use disorders, is they don't feel good because, just drinking water isn't going to make them feel good because their dopamine receptors are down-regulated. So they don't get the same kind of pleasure out of everyday things, out of eating, drinking, playing with their children. They don't get the same pleasure that folks who have recovered from substance use disorders or in recovery or in longer-term recovery, we see that coming back. And folks in our healing to wellness courts, we see that's one of the most amazing things of being, a team member of a healing to wellness course, to see people blossom and being able to start taking pleasure in things that they weren't taking pleasure in at all when they came into our program. This is showing the changes and the decrease in, we know that people need to use more and more drugs to feel the same, and that people don't feel normal unless they have their drug in their system until they're really in longer term recovery. And as I said, the message is people do heal. The brains can heal. So this is a meth user. So 1 month, so this is 30 days into your healing to wellness court. If somebody is able to get into your healing to wellness court and stop using right away, which never happens, otherwise they wouldn't need to be in our healing to wellness court. So, but 1 month after they've stopped using, you can see the low amount of dopamine receptors. And then this is 14 months. So this is, probably about the time they're going to be graduating from some of our programs. You can see that the brain has healed. So the dopamine receptors are back now. You can see the red. So it doesn't mean that they're completely healed, that their brain is back to normal, because when somebody has a substance use disorder, their brain is never going to be back to quote unquote normal of a person without a substance use disorder. But they've healed. So they're, as I talked about, they're able to start feeling pleasure of normal things that we as folks who don't have substance use disorders can get pleasure out of. But it takes time. And for family treatment courts, when we're talking about reunification planning, we're talking about permanency planning, there's really a disconnect. So courts that follow ASFA, the Adoption of the Safe Families Act, where there's these really tight timelines that have to be followed, the healing from a substance use disorder time frame, it does not fit within that federal regulation of reunification. That's a whole nother discussion, but just to keep that in mind, that it takes a long time for the brain to heal. And everybody's different, of course. Everybody's brain heals differently. I love this. This is my favorite brain scan. These are really old scans, but I just think that they really illustrate well for people who aren't neuroscientists, and illustrate well for our team members that are folks who are coming into our healing wellness court. At first, their brains they're not really able to be present just because of the damage to the brain that's been caused by substance use disorders. So the top is the control again. So this is glucose metabolism. So our brains use glucose to think, to process. That's the energy that our brain uses. So metabolism means that's glucose being turned over in our brains as energy. So again, red and yellow is a lot of glucose metabolism. 10 days of sobriety from cocaine, the glucose metabolism is greatly decreased. Just over 3 months of sobriety, the glucose metabolism has not returned to normal. So people's brains are still not functioning at the same level, even 3 months after they've stopped using cocaine their brains are still not back to where they would be if they had never started using cocaine. And it's really, just a kind of a way to illustrate that even 3 months of sobriety isn't really stable sobriety yet. People are still healing and still getting better. And it's 3 months is really early recovery. So trauma and stress also cause changes to the brain, and changes that may cause people to act in really unexpected ways. But trauma it's again another survival mechanism for the brain. And we need to be able to react quickly to things like dangers, like that giraffe. We need to be able to decide whether that's danger or not danger really quickly. If the giraffe is in a cage, not danger probably. If the giraffe is about to walk in front of you, in front of your vehicle, that's danger, and you need to be able to react to that. Need to be able to react to it before you think about it. So, I live in northern New Mexico, so we do have mountain lions here. And if I'm out hiking, I need to know whether if something jumps down behind me, I need to be able to react, to spin around, to get ready. My heart starts beating. You start breathing. You're having the sympathetic reaction, which is a part of the brain's, is telling you to start breathing faster. Your heart rate gets up. You're ready to fight. You're ready to run away. And what's going on is the image or the sight or the image is going to your amygdala way faster than it's going to your cortex. And it has to go to your amygdala faster because your amygdala has to say, okay, thump behind me, potential danger, react, and it tells your body to react before you can spin around and think about, oh, is that Kiki or is that a mountain lion? You don't want to think about, is that Kiki or is that a mountain lion? You want to react as if it's a mountain lion, because if you think about whether it's Kiki or a mountain lion, you might have blown your chance to react already. So, you're reacting, your heart rate's going up, you're breathing, and then you spin around, and then it is Kiki. So that's Kiki in her mountain lion costume. And for those of us without a trauma history, we're able to, immediately our heart rate goes down. Immediately we slow down our breathing. Immediately we laugh and go, ah, ha, ha, and then continue on with our hike. But for folks who have, if the mountain lion lived with them, basically, they grew up in a traumatic household, they grew up with substance use disorder, they grew up in chaos, they grew up in domestic violence. So their stress response is already really high, their trauma response is high. In their brain, the connectivity to the amygdala is really strengthened. So they're going to be sensing danger much quicker than folks who don't have a trauma history. And the connection to the cortex, to the thinking part of the brain, is decreased in people. So the connections get weakened in people with a trauma history with toxic stress in their lives. So they're much more likely to react to trauma as if it's a danger, or react to anything as if it's a danger, to be triggered. So if they grew up, if they come into a courtroom and there's a dark corner because we were lazy about changing the light bulbs, we might not think anything of it, but somebody who has some sort of trauma might get triggered by a dark corner, or they might get triggered by something that we have no control over, even if, we do everything we can to make our courtroom as friendly and not scary, but, we can't always control what people's trauma might be. So people might be having a trauma response and we have no way to control it, but we can understand that that might be what's going on. So we need to back off and de-escalate. And if somebody's, because we've all seen people getting upset in court and, putting up their fists or puffing up or shrinking down. And those are all kinds of trauma responses that we need to understand, that if somebody's in a trauma response, they're not going to be, it's not helpful to any of us to try to continue with questioning them or talking with them. A lot of what we do is try to prevent triggering people into a trauma response by talking to them in trauma-informed ways, using motivational interviewing that Judge Garrow did such a great job of talking about yesterday, I watched it yesterday. So, those are things that we need to be aware of, that, and also just be aware of when that's happening. So we need to know our participants well enough to know when something might be happening in that their behavior has changed. So it does remodel the brain. as I talked about, the connectivity to the prefrontal cortex is diminished, so people their impulse control is decreased. And so this is the historical trauma. So it's called epigenetics when you're talking about it scientifically. And this is the intergenerational transfer of risk and resiliency. And it happens through binding of molecules onto the DNA. So this ladder-like structure is the DNA. I'm not going to get into this very much because it's really intense and it's a whole nother talk. But it binds, and what that does is it causes some proteins to be expressed. So like stress hormones will be expressed more in people whose parents and grandparents, great-grandparents, elders, forebears went through a traumatic history, like a genocide or the Holocaust or a starvation event. So descendants of those folks are more likely to have a higher expression of stress hormones or other physical manifestations, other health manifestations. Sometimes there's cardiac involvement. So it's really interesting. And, I talked about that mouse that smelled that pleasant cherry scent and, was shocked. And so then it had stress whenever it smelled that pleasant cherry scent. So this is mouse. So this mouse was made to be afraid of that cherry scent because it was shocked when it got the cherry scent. So this mouse mated with another mouse, and that mouse doesn't have any fear of the cherry scent. But guess what? Their children have that fear of the cherry scent, even though the children were never exposed to shock and the cherry scent. So they were never shocked, but when they were exposed to the cherry scent, they had an elevated stress reaction. That mouse was mated to another mouse, and those children, so the grandchildren of the original mouse, still exhibited higher levels of fear of the cherry scent, even though they never had any exposure to the shock and the cherry scent. So, the science is starting to catch up to this epigenetics. So we just know, so if have, a family where there's, we know it goes through cycles, their parents, their grandparents, their great-grandparents have all struggled with trauma, that's going to be passed down potentially to the children. And I'm not saying that it's, of course, again, it's not hopeless, but it's just, we're going to be aware that this is in place and that we need to, give supports and understand that we need to start working, building in resiliency and creating factors that are resilient indicators and build those folks. And of course, we know that for children, the best indicator of resiliency is having a safe, stable, strong person in your life. And sometimes that person is the judge. I know I was told that recently by a child who had aged out of foster care, and she was amazing. And, I didn't think about that. I was that one safe person in her life, but, I saw her regularly, I talked with her, I mentored her. And then now she actually works for the Pueblo, and she, was in a conference and talking about that safe, stable person in her life. And I was like, oh, I wonder if that's her cheer coach. I was just kind of curious about who it was because I didn't know. And then she turned to me and said, and that was you, Judge. And I was like, oh, you don't know that you're that safe, stable person in that kiddo's life. So, that's, as judges and as people on service providers, we could be that person. So we need to make sure that we're providing that stability and being those role models. And again, this is just showing the many ways that the brain is affected by trauma and substance use. So treatment, I'm just going to touch on this. There's other people who are more experts. I'm not a clinician, but as a judge, we need to understand treatment well enough to know whether our providers are giving evidence-based treatment. We also need to understand that we can't force people into treatment until, their physiological needs are met. If they're homeless, substance use disorder treatment isn't really going to be that helpful for them. If they're super stressed about if they're living in their car with their kids, we need to take care of that stuff before we can move up this is the hierarchy of needs. But we really need to understand where we're at. Most of the time when people are coming into wellness court, their hierarchy of needs, they're here. They're food insecure. They might not have a great shelter. In Pojoaque, we've been working really hard to provide shelter. We do have some sober living spaces, housing spaces that we've been providing for about 3 years now, and that's really helped some of our participants get a foundation of stability so that they can, move up and really start digging in on their treatment. And we just need to be aware as judges where our participants are as far as the hierarchy of needs. And you guys all know this about dependence versus addiction. I always like to throw this in because I do run across people who do not believe in medicine for addiction treatment. And when I say believe, that should be in quotes. And of course, we know that Suboxone and Methadone can be amazing for people the same way that insulin is amazing for people who have type 1 diabetes. Suboxone and Methadone for people who have opioid use disorder can create amazing changes. And we've seen it. So it's not that they're addicted, because addiction requires a negative consequence of use. And for treatment with Suboxone and Methadone, there's generally not a negative consequences of use if it's being used as prescribed by the physician. And so tapering off, judges are not medical doctors. So we can't require people to taper off. We can't require people to use Vivitrol, naltrexone rather than Suboxone, because we're not doctors. That's a decision between the client and their physician of how much to use, how little to use. We can't say, oh, that's too high of a dose. We're not, that's not our role, to say they're giving you too much methadone. That is not our role. We're not there to make that judgment. That's a decision between, and it may be that, I've actually had clients where I thought they were getting too low Suboxone. And so, you can ask, why don't you talk to your doctor about X? Or we've had people with alcohol use disorder who, and we've seen lots of people use naltrexone for that. And it's been very beneficial. So you can suggest, why don't you have a discussion with your doctor about getting naltrexone? But we can't say, and I can't write a prescription for naltrexone. That's not my role. So, we need to stay in our lanes. This is just showing the mechanism of action about that. They do work on the dopamine receptors to stop those down, or the opioid receptors to stop the release of dopamine downstream. We all see this, that in our programs, that the healing happens through the connection. And that's why COVID is really hard on our participants, because they can't have these connections that they used to have with, doing crafts together, which is what they used to do in our courts, and taking classes and having peer recovery groups. So we have to be creative now and create these connections without in either tiny groups that are separated or online. This was a famous experiment called Rat Park. There's this great talk by this guy named Johann Hari who talks about Rat Park. So it's a TED Talk, for those of you in TED Talk who like TED Talks. His name is Johann Hari, Hari. But rats were made addicted to cocaine water in these isolation cages. And then these rats were put into, this rat park where they got to run around and have fun. And so when they're in this rat park, they were given the option of using cocaine water, they didn't use it. And it's just really symbolic of that. This isolation and is really a contributor to folks not being able to be successful in their recovery. And there's been a lot of talks about recovery capital and, peer recovery supports. And those are so key that, those really need to be emphasized to make those connections. And again, we're all struggling with that, with creating the pro-social activities. So these are some of the things that we try to do. We have a great organization near here called the Santa Fe Mountain Center that does outdoor activities with folks. We call it the Goya Project, because one of the things is really to get people to get out and be active and not to be just on the couch watching Netflix, but to recover is really tied to being outside, or not outside, but being outside yourself and working and doing volunteer activities, doing community service. So we have people, we give them a bag, we give them one of those clippy things to pick up trash, and they go out and clean up the walk paths and clean up around the Pueblo so that they stay active, if they're not working. I talked about community meals that we're having. So again, we're all struggling with creating these pro-social activities. And, there's lots of ways you can work towards having a healing focused court. Get a trauma assessment. So you can do trauma self-assessments if you Google that. There are forms to look at the environment, to look at what's going on in your courts to see if you can create a more safe environment. All of my team has this trauma certification from an organization. It was an online course, and we all went through I think it was like 8 classes with tests, and we all got certified on the trauma. Motivational interviewing, again, Judge Garrow gave a great talk about that, using seeking safety and other trauma. Now, reflective supervision and rules reduction are 2 things that we're focusing on in my court. Again, this is a work in progress, so I don't want you to think that we're all, on top of this and doing awesome, but it's what our goals are. So reflective supervision is really tied to kind of motivational interviewing, because it's really about active listening, understanding the other person. And this is reflective supervision of the team, reflective supervision of staff, also reflective supervision of participants. And it's really about understanding the participant, looking at them through the lens of where they may be coming from, where they're at, a collaboration rather than, judge up on the bench, probation officer, holding the client, or the child in the mind if it's a family treatment court. Also talking about, does the team feel safe with the judge? I know some of my team members feel totally safe with me, and they'll come in and say, Judge, you're full of shit. And that's fine. I have no problem with that. And other of my team members will go to my probation officer and say, Dawn, go tell the judge she's full of shit, because that's, and sometimes I am full of shit. So I need to be told I'm wrong, or I'm looking at things wrong, or I don't understand. And, my team, sometimes we butt heads and sometimes we're on the same page, but that's part of being on a team. And the judge has to trust the team. So I need to be able to trust that I'm getting the information that I need to make decisions or to interact with the client. And I'll show you what our weekly staff form is like in just a minute, because when we have staffing, what I want to know the information that I need, so that when I'm sitting down in court, that I can have a meaningful interaction with the client. So I can use motivational interviewing, and I can use, know that they had a bad week, know that what was going on, I need that information, or I can't have a meaningful interaction. And that's one of the most important things in a healing to wellness court, is for the client to have a meaningful interaction with the judge. Now I have these donkeys here, and I have these on my bench. My spouse gives me these donkeys for Christmas, for my birthday, and it's to remind me not to be a jackass. So I have them on my bench, and it's a reminder to me that I can't be a jackass, that I have to be compassionate and kind and understanding of where our participants are at.
And Judge, there was a question asking if you wouldn't mind sharing the online trauma certification course that your staff has taken.
I can, I'll give you all that information. I can, and you guys can send it out to whoever or put it as part of the resources.
Great.
So we work with rules reduction in our wellness court. So we actually threw out all the rules. I think I don't have any rules in I used to have please silence your cell phone, but people know how to do that now. So I don't even have that rule. And if people's cell phone goes off in court, who cares? They turn it off, whatever. It wasn't a big deal. So, people, especially in wellness court, in other hearings, it might be a little more formal, but for wellness court, I don't care if people bring food or drink in, whatever. We want people to come. If somebody wants to wear a hat, who cares? Maybe that's what is making them feel safe. Sometimes people, when I'm traveling, or when I used to travel, I usually wear a baseball hat because I don't like to interact with people I don't know. So it's a way of me being able to be safe. I don't care what people wear, as long as it's not like a, obviously marijuana leaf or a beer logo. That's something that, that's a bridge too far. But we ask ourselves, is this rule about safety or support? We don't want people to be late. I don't freak out if people are late, but being late is not supportive of your peers, because you're interacting with somebody's story when you're coming in late. But what is not wearing shorts, or not having food or drink, or not chewing gum? Those have nothing about safety and support in them. So who cares about those? We throw those rules out. We don't have those rules. Sometimes rules are just for us. Is it about exerting power and control? So I think, okay, we're trying to make this person do X. Now, is there a reason that we want them to do that, or are we just want to exert power and control over them? Is it for a treatment? Is there a treatment goal in mind when we want them to go to a certain group, or that we want them to show up at a certain place or do something? Or is it because we want to exert power and control over them? So that's a struggle we have constantly, and that I have in my head constantly, is because I do get mad. You know, I'm a judge. I want people to do what I tell them to do. But, you know, am I telling them to do something because I'm mad at them and I just want to exert some power over them and, you know, make them feel a little smaller because I'm the judge and they're not? So those are, you know, we struggle with this all the time. And of course I get pissed when people don't show up, and I get pissed when people are late, and I get, you know, but we have to think about what our long-term goals are. And me getting pissed, or the probation officer getting pissed at somebody for being late, isn't helpful. I mean, if it's constant and we think they're doing it because we are pretty calm and compassionate when people aren't compliant, you know, so it's definitely, it's always a balance. It's always a balance. And people, you know, we're pretty relaxed, and we let people kind of push us a lot until we give them a sanction, because we're trying to figure out if, you know, if they have a true obstacle or what the obstacle is. And we ask them, you know, what's the obstacle to you showing up on time? And we try to work with them before we start hammering them with any kind of community service or other sanctions. You know, we did start imposing, if people completely blow off a treatment group that they're supposed to be in as part of their treatment, then, you know, we do impose a sanction on that, because, but not right away, not when they're right in the beginning of their program, because we're still trying to kind of get a feel for where they're at, and they're trying to get used to us. So, you know, everything's always going to be a case-by-case basis of whether the rule needs to be followed, or whether it's just something that we're trying to exert power and control over the client about. You know, and this is all tied in how you communicate with folks. So Judge Garrow mentioned the soft eyes and hard eyes. So it's really important to maintain calm, maintain kindness on your face, you know, have your eyebrows raised a little bit and smile. And, you know, I joke about it because sometimes I'm just faking it. Sometimes I'm like, oh my gosh, I am so tired. You know, it's exhausting. And I don't know if all the teams really understand that's really exhausting. A wellness court judge, because you're trying to listen so hard and communicate and ask good questions and think about and remember what the team told you to ask about, and listen and riff off of what the client is telling you, and think of motivational interviewing questions. And it's exhausting. And so sometimes you're just like, oh my God, I need this day to end, but you still have to be there and be present. So sometimes you're really just like kind of faking being kind, and that's okay. You know, because we're human, and sometimes we're exhausted or hungry, or, you know, we got into a fight with our spouse the night before, you know, things are going on for us too, but we can't let that affect how we're interacting with our clients. So you can look over this in the slides about trauma-informed communication. So this is what my staff gives me for our progress notes. So, you know, during our staffing, we put this up on a big screen that we all can see. You know, and this is something that we've made ourselves through much trial and error, and it's always a work in progress. And I've actually learned how to program and access so I can change the database. So this is obviously a fake one, Michael Scott from the office. But it gives me all the information I need to know, so I can have a meaningful interaction. So my staff actually have what they call the pre-staffing staffing. So they have a staffing without me, like on Fridays. Our wellness courts are on Monday and Tuesday. So on Fridays they have a pre-staffing staffing, so that when we have our staffing and we're trying to deal with 10, 15, and 10 people on Mondays and about 15 to 20 people on Tuesdays, that, you know, we can just move things along and not like, why didn't they go to the meeting? I don't know. I don't know why they didn't go to the meeting. They figure out why they didn't go to the meeting before they come talk to me in our staffing. And this is the information that I see. And, you know, so I have this section here called what the judge should ask the participant. And this is what, you know, I'm trying to get my staff to put in a question kind of in a motivational interviewing way, or give me something like, okay, the person's on MRT step 5. So you should ask them, you know, what were some of your best times? And I always take the MRT book into the hearings with me now. So I can flip to MRT step 5, that's moral recognition therapy. for those of you who don't know, but it's one of the, and so whatever treatment step they might be on, or you can see that this person, so the person, I can see that they missed a test, which is considered a positive. And then I can ask about that. But otherwise, I can see that they did their other, which is their better intervention. I can see they did that, so we can get through people really quickly because I can scan this and see everything they've done, and that they had an actual positive here. Here they had a missed positive, and here they had an actual positive. And then we have notes here that the person's on a transdermal monitor, that they're in our sober living facility, and the positive was for meth. So we can see all this, see what stage of change they're in, a question about their stage of change, that they've completed all their assessments, so see what milestone they're on, what kind of progress they made, any kind of prevention plan, and then also down here any incentives or sanctions. And here, so one of our incentives is we give people tokens, which are really raffle tickets that we put into a jar, and we draw every week for little tiny prizes. And we also give bigger incentives, and we also give a lot of praise, of course, and positive reinforcement. And then the sanction was an essay. We give essays a lot in community service. So just so so however you want to set it up, but the judge really needs to have this kind of information so they can have a trauma-informed interactions with the client, not just, why did you miss that meeting? Or why did you miss that check-in? I can see you missed a check-in, but it's about, what was your barrier to coming in? And sometimes it's like, oh my God, I forgot, or sometimes it's, I had to take my kid to the ER, so a lot of it is just figuring out how to have a discussion with your clients while you're working through. And, so the basic end message is all the participants have strengths and everyone can heal if we give them, the space and the chance. And you never know who's going to be the great success in your wellness court. So we have really low barrier. As long as they meet the eligibility of being high risk, high needs, we don't look into whether we think they're going to succeed, because you don't know who's going to succeed at the beginning of a wellness court journey. I think that's it. That's all I have.
Great. Thank you so much, Judge McGinnis. We did have one question come in. It's regarding studies back in the 2000s that thought that there was differences in how men and women's brains reacted to drugs, and they were asking what your thoughts were on gender differences.
Yes, and I'm giving that's actually a slide that I took in, put out. There are definitely gender differences between how men and women react to drugs, or how they process through their substance use disorders. Like women tend to have more polysubstance use disorders than men do. And there's lots of different substance, as far as treatment goes, they really need to be, the gender needs to be taken into account. And that's one of the things when you're looking for treatment providers, to know that they understand that there are differences between men and women, and that they would have gender specific groups is really one of the keys also. So yes, there's definitely differences between men and women and how they react and how they develop substance use disorders, and how they continue them, and in how to treat them.
Great, thank you so much, Judge McGinnis. And there was a lot of positive comments, and a lot of people love the framework for the rules as well. And I just want to say thank you again for this amazing training. I think everyone found it really helpful and super knowledgeable and informative. I also want to thank everyone else as well for attending session D4, creating a place of welcome, mitigating trauma in the courthouse by understanding changes to the brain. After this time, you may find recordings of all enhancement training sessions at enhancementtraining.org.
And also, here's my contact information, my email. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to email me directly. I'm happy to respond.